Okay, so let's talk about functions. Google Sheets has over 400 functions right now, and I'm pretty sure they're gonna add more. So if we look at their functions documentation, see they have, well, all of these functions, and usually there are many categories of functions. So you see there are database functions, date functions, I don't know, it keeps going in many categories. But in this video, I'm gonna go over certain functions you should know in Google Sheets. So getting back here, even though there are so many functions, the syntax for functions is always the same. And the syntax for functions is going to be the name of the function with a set of parentheses following it. In Google Sheets, if you're starting a formula, which you hopefully already know, you have to start with an equal sign. Now, after the equal sign, you could do a basic formula when you say, let's say this B2 plus this other cell, right? And you can hit enter and that will give you your total. So that's not a function. This is a basic formula, no functions in this formula. Now, in this same formula, see after the equal sign, I can now use a function. So when you want to use a function, you have to start with the name of the functions. So one of those functions, for example, is called sum. And you type the name of the function, and you can see how Google Sheets shows me other functions that it has that starts with the word sum, and then there are some other words following that. So for example, there is SUMSQ, which is sum of squares. If I do sum and open parentheses and close parentheses, this is our regular function syntax. So what you're gonna see as a difference between the functions is that you are going to just type a different name. So instead of sum, it will be SUMSQ to get the sum of squares, for example, right? Or in this case, we're gonna go back to sum. Now, in between those parentheses, you provide what's called an argument to this function. Now, you'll see that I'm gonna get this help that's down here when I'm between these parentheses. Now, if I click over here, outside of it, see that disappears. But when I click back inside of that parentheses, it shows me what this function expects from me. So what it says is that it needs a value. And then below it gives us an example. It says this is a range that you can provide. So for example, I can go B2 colon B9. And that will be the range I'm planning to sum up. So if I hit enter right now, I'm just gonna get the total of all of that. Now, if I go back to this, you'll see that there is this helper that shows me value 1, and then there is a comma, and then there is this value 2 in square brackets, and then comma, and then this. So what is that supposed to mean? So when you see the square brackets in this helpers, in this functions, that's basically telling you that this is an optional parameter. You don't really have to use it, but you could. Now in this case, when I did this, when I did sum of B2 colon B9, I only did value 1, and I didn't do comma and do value 2 because value 2 is in square brackets, so it means it's optional. Now, I don't have to really skip it. I could actually use it. So let me give you an example. So I'm going to go back here, and instead of going from B2 through B9, let's say I'm going to go from B2 through B3. So that will be my first range. Now then I can do comma, and that moves me, see, to value 2, and it highlights it right here in this tooltip. So now the value 2 could be another range I'm trying to sum up. So I could grab, let's say, from here through here. And now it's gonna take all of these and add with all of those. And now because I'm skipping this one, I can use this comma to separate those ranges. Now then I can do another comma, because see, after the comma value 2, it gives us this. That means you can keep going. So if I do another comma, see, I'm gonna go, let's say, also grab this. So basically I'm grabbing everything that's type A in this case. So I selected these 2, these 3, and this one. So by doing this, I hit enter. See, it gives me the total of those. What you're gonna see with all functions in Google Sheets is that commas are separators of different arguments in a function. Some functions will have multiple arguments, some functions will have a single argument, and certain functions will have 0 arguments. So that's possible too. So let me give you an example of a function with no arguments. So if I hit escape here, I go here and type equals today, open parentheses. See, in this function, it doesn't tell me that it needs something in it. So basically, I just close parentheses, and there is no arguments in between. So I hit enter, and this function is simply going to return today's date. And what's useful about this function is that tomorrow it's going to update to tomorrow's date, and every day is going to update to that particular day. But this would be a function with no arguments. So parentheses, but there's nothing in between. So the main thing about functions is that they usually return something. So return is basically like a fancy way of saying that it gives you some sort of result. So when you use a function, you're expecting to get back some sort of result from that function. And whatever that result is going to be, it's going to be used in that position in that formula. Let's see an example of that. So for example, if I did a formula equal sign and I said, I'm going to take this plus this, and then I'm going to do plus this, and then plus this, plus this. You see where this is going. I'm adding those together. So it gives me this number on top. So another way to look at this formula, instead of going one by one, I could say, well, let's add these two together. So if I did like equal sum, and I do these two together, that will give me some number. This is 340,000, right? Then if I do another sum and do these three, that will give me the total of those. And then if I do yet another sum and do this, that will give me this. So now if I think about this formula like this, I can say I have this 340,783 number plus 502,660 number plus this 89,000 number, still gonna give me the same total. But instead of typing this number 340,783, I can just use a function that will return that number. So I'm gonna clear that and I'm gonna replace it with a function sum, where I'm going to say let's do this too, and that is going to use the sum function to return that value, which we will use in our formula later on. So enter, that gives us the same thing. I can go and replace this one with another sum function, and I can say that should be summing from here through here. And then finally, I could also replace this. Well, since it's a single cell, I'm not gonna do sum, I'm just gonna click on that. So the idea is that I can have a function added to another function and then added to another cell value to get total value. Now, like I said a second ago, some functions have optional arguments like this one, see in square brackets, and there are also some functions that have required arguments. So in this case, this value 1 is required argument because it's not in square brackets. And what that means is that I cannot skip it. So I can't do sum and not do anything and hit enter. See, it gives me an error. And see, if I look at this error message, it says wrong number of arguments to sum. Expected at least one argument. So now let's take a look at a function that might have not one, but multiple required arguments, right? So for that, I'm going to use something like SUMIFS. So if I use this function, SUMIFS, you'll see that the first argument in this function, it says it's sum range. And then it says do comma and do criteria range 1, and it's also not in square brackets, so it's not optional. And then there is the criteria 1, which is also not optional, so not square brackets. But then we do have some optional arguments here following that. So let's use this. So sum range is gonna be, in my case, all of these, comma, and then we have a criteria range. So my criteria range is gonna be this range, comma, and finally the third required argument is the criteria for this criteria range, and I'm going to say just use a, and I'm putting it in quotes because in formulas text needs to always go in quotes, because otherwise if I type the letter A, it will think that's either a reference to a cell or it's a function called A. See, it's looking already for a function from this function list. So I can't do that. So I want to make sure that this is treated as text, so it's in quotes. Close parentheses, hit enter, and that gives me the same number. So when you're trying to do something like this, you don't want to really do any of these other methods that I did before by selecting numbers. You want to use something like conditional SUMIFS function that will let you just filter to something in particular you're trying to get. In this case, I was trying to get everything that's type A. Now this function, see, also after this, you can do a comma and do an optional criteria range too. So I could do a comma and then say, well, the second range of my criteria is going to be this, comma, and my criteria is going to be, again, in quotes. I'm going to make sure I'm only summing things where the cost is greater than $100,000. I'm going to hit enter. So that gives me that. So basically what I'm doing by doing this, I'm checking in this range from C2 to C9 if this number for the cost is greater than 100,000, and then I'm adding that to the total. And at the same time, it also has to pass this criteria, which is type A. So this would be, see, a second optional argument. I didn't have to do this. It works without it. But I could use a second argument as well. And then if you look here, I can also do comma and continue, because there's three little dots that basically tells you you can go for another one and then keep going. So I could then do a comma and do yet another criteria if I wanted to do something like that. But otherwise, that's fine. I'm going to hit enter. That's going to give me my total. Well, so far we talked about sum function, which sums numbers up. We talked about SUMIFS, which gives you conditional summing. Now, similar to sum, so I'm going to go back to the sum function where I sum all of these numbers, close parentheses, hit enter to get me my total. That's the total of all of those. Now, if I wanted to get the average of all of those, I'm going to just switch this to average function. And see, I'm not really changing much. I'm basically keeping the same syntax for the function. I'm just saying average of those, please. And then it's going to give me the average. And then if I look at this parentheses, I go inside of it. See, it says you can do comma and do an optional second argument like I did with some functions before, and comma separate multiple ranges to get the average of those. Hopefully you get the idea. Now, again, instead of average, I could do something like, let's say, median. And you can see how tooltips are giving us the same syntax for this function. So again, the same deal as with sum, with average, but this time we're going to get the median. There are a lot of different functions you can do. So far, I did median, I did sum. You can also do things like count. So similar idea here. See, if you look here, the first one is required. The second one is optional. So if I do this, I hit enter, that will give me 8. And it simply counts. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 things in here. Now, there is a function count, and there is a function COUNTA. And if I do COUNTA, I hit enter, I'm going to get the same 8. So the difference between COUNTA and count is that count will only count numbers. So for example, if this is, let's say, that, and this function, see, now returns an error because I'm trying to add text to these numbers, it's getting an error. But here, so if I look at this, see, COUNTA gives me 8. It counts there are 8 things here. Now, if I switch this to count, I hit enter, this gives me 6 because count is only numeric count. So it's only going to count numbers. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 numbers in this range. Now, COUNTA will count any cell that's not blank. So it will not count blanks though. So if this is blank, see, it's 7. So that's count and COUNTA function. Very common functions you might use. And then there is also, similar to like sum and SUMIFS, there's also a conditional version for this, which is COUNTIFS. ifs. So here in this function, see the first thing is criteria range and then criteria. So if I go here and select this range, oops, let me clear this. Go back here and select this range. That's the range, and comma, and then I'm going to say, let's count how many A's we have. I hit enter, I get 6. Now, again, similar to SUMIFS, you can use an optional second criteria. So I could say, could you only count the ones where in this range it's greater than 100,000? Close parentheses, hit enter, and now it says there are 4. So now what it's doing, we're only counting A's where cost is greater than 100,000. So this is 1, this is 2. Now this one isn't because this is not greater than 100,000. So far we got 2, then we have 3, 4, and this one is less than 100,000. So we got 4. And there it is. So similar to these few, remember how I did average? So if I go back to average, select these numbers, I'm probably going to go back to my numbers like this, and let me just get this average back here. So average, and I'm going to select these numbers, close parentheses, hit enter. That will be the average. So that's our regular average function. And then similar to SUMIFS and COUNTIFS, there's also conditional average, which is AVERAGEIFS. And then we can just select an average range. So similar to SUMRange, the first thing in AVERAGEIFS function is the range of numbers you would like to average. So I'm going to say these. Oops, and this happens in Google Sheets. And if it happens, you just have to go back and correct it. Close this, go back after parentheses and select these. That's good, comma. And then you have the criteria range. So I'll select this as my criteria, comma, and I'll say, let's just grab B's only. So quote B and quotation again. Hit enter, and now we're getting the average only for the ones that are type B in this particular case. We have sum, we have average, we have count, and we have the conditional version for all of those. And finally, there are some optional arguments that have defaults if you don't provide them. So let me give you an example of that. Let's work with this number. I have this total, and I want to just round this number. So let me actually just make it something like this. So I'm going to go here and use round function. Open parentheses as usual. See, in parentheses, if I go in here, it gives me value is the first required argument. So I'm going to use this number as a value. And then I'm not going to use a second parameter, which is places. Just like that, I'm going to hit enter. And by default, what's going to happen is that if you don't provide the second argument, it's going to default to a whole number. Right now, it took this number and it basically rounded to a whole number. Now, if you wanted to round it to a particular decimal point, you can do comma, and then you could do 1. So that would be 1 decimal point. So see, it's giving me the 75. Now it rounded to 0.8. So that's 1 decimal point rounding. Don't pay attention to this 80. That's just the formatting. So actually, I'm just going to take that off for a second. Something like that. See, now we get to 1 decimal point. If I do 2, that will give me 2 decimal point, which is what we already have. And then if I did 0, that will give me a whole number. So when you don't provide this 0, it basically just defaults to 0. And then you might ask, so how would I know that it usually defaults to 0, right? So the way you know, see, if I open this, it gives me this tips for the function. And then there's this learn more about round. So if I click on that, that will give me documentation for this function. And here it explains what this function is going to do. And then it gives you some examples of what's going to happen when you use this function with different parameters. And if I scroll down, see below, it explains the function. So first, this is the first argument, value. and then places. See, it says optional 0 by default. So it shows that 0 is default. You don't really have to use it, but you could. And then more documentation here. If you're interested, you could look into it. That gives you, see, other rounding functions. There's also round up, round down, and so on. And that should cover how to read function syntax, how to follow these tips, because it's impossible to remember all the arguments for all functions. You want to be able to just look here through these tips and follow the lead and make sure you're getting things in the right positions. And then if you have some questions, click learn more and try to read through this and see some of these examples, and hopefully that will clear what's going on with that function. And for this video, that should do it. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.